So I was thinking we could talk about what you need to be ready to do, not even about like actually passing the assessment, but what you need to be ready to do in the first couple weeks after you have engaged a C3PO to assess you.
Are we starting with scoping stuff?
Let's actually start ahead of that. So
Okay.
let's assume that you've gone through some discussions with the C3PO to identify the complexity of your environment. You know, do a basic verification that you are doing CMMC. You know, you've done a self-assessment at least once, for example. That's a good check. And the C3PO has given you a price and they've said, you know, let's go do this, right? So now we're starting, okay? So typically the first thing the C3PO is going to do, at least us, okay, so actually I'm going to start talking about Kieri Solutions specifically, because I don't know about other C3POs. We are going to send you two documents. One is called an intake information request, and the other document is called the next steps. The next steps document has a list of tasks and dates and responsibilities, and it also has a frequently asked questions, and it also has an escalation list. You know, here's who you call if you need to reschedule things. Here's who you call if you're having trouble reaching your team lead, right? So the first tasks that we put into the next steps are, you need to do the intake information request document, which is a bunch of questions about your environment, which is used to describe your general operations as a summary to our assessment team, so we kind of understand what's going on. You need to submit scoping artifacts to us.
There's a list.
There's a list. Before submitting any artifacts to us, we need to arrange a way of securely transmitting information. So don't email us. That's a Kieri Solutions thing. We set up a secure file share. Then we need to identify who has access to that secure file share, right?
You can host it or we can.
Yep.
One or the other.
Yep. If you're requesting a CMMC assessment, we're hoping that you have a great secure file share, because that's kind of one of the ways that you need to be able to do data, right? And then we're going to schedule a scoping call. Hopefully about 2 weeks ahead of time, at least, or maybe a few months ahead of time if we've got a long runway. So for the scoping conversation, what do they need, Jill? What do they need to provide us?
The first thing is asset inventory with categories, and telling us why they've chosen categories for certain things. Diagram, so network diagram, data flow diagram. What else? I've said inventories.
The last one that I'm thinking of is the system security plan.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually the full list.
Yeah, I think
so.
And sometimes people have a lot of that stuff in their SSP. So however you have it.
Yep. A lot. Yeah, exactly. Small companies. I think, like, for example, my company, I just had it all in the SSP. So let's talk about that asset inventory. So, super important. And this is actually one of the things that we have the most struggle with is companies are like, oh my goodness, what do you mean you need a list of all of our in-scope assets? That's crazy.
What are you talking about categories?
Right. And we're like, well, you've been working with a RPO, right? And they didn't warn you that we need to have that. Like that's the basic starting point of scoping is we need that. It's listed in the scoping guide from the Department of Defense. So what we need is a listing of your hardware assets. That could be network devices, your firewalls, your switches,
Mobile devices,
laptops,
servers.
cell phones, servers, user endpoints, if they have desktops, any other appliances you might have, network attached storage, big database servers, right? If it's connected to your in-scope environment, meaning it shares a network link with at least one CUI asset, you should have it in that asset inventory. If it's something that most assessors are going to assume are in scope, even if it's not for some reason, you should also have it in that asset inventory. Now that's a request, that's a should, right? So if you've got, say, a website that's disconnected from everything, it's out of scope, it's very nice for us if you can list it and say it's out of scope and then tell us why, right? Because there's firewalls in between or whatever, and the SSP should be mentioning this stuff too.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was the hardware, right? So what do we need from the hardware? We need you to identify a CMMC asset category using the CMMC Level 2 scoping guide for each row, for each item, just one category. And let me break out a little bit more to that, okay? Because this is a super, super misunderstood topic. So look at the scoping guide, because, even if you go by what I say, if you miss some of the nuance from the scoping guide, we're going to force you to do what the scoping guide says. So pick one asset category and assign it to every single one of your assets. Printers are important to list off too. All right, so the next type of asset category, or the next type of thing that we need to list off in our asset inventory.
People.
I can hear a couple people screaming in the background right now that people are not assets. And that's a good point, but we need them inventoried. So same deal where you have to pick an asset category for your people. It's very important for us that any person who has privileged access to your information system is listed individually, and we should know basically what their role is, right? Now, if you've got 100,000 people in your company and you've got 1,000 privileged people, okay, we should probably talk a little bit further. But in most cases, if you've got less than 20 privileged people, we really want to see them listed by name.
Including like MSP people, anybody that has privileged access.
Mm-hmm. If you're managing their access, you need to know who has access by name. And then your regular users should be listed as well. There is some allowance, again, if you have 100,000 users, you might be able to say, look, all the users that belong to this security group or all the users that belong to this department are CUI assets or they're contractor risk managed assets, right? And you can group to some degree. But if we come to you and we say we need that list of everyone in the department, you need to be able to get that list. It's a expectation of CMMC that you know who has access on a granular level. What's next?
Clouds, external stuff.
Okay. Okay, so your asset inventory should include your clouds. Your clouds should also have these CMMC categories assigned. Now, many clouds are complex. So there's some clouds that they just do file sharing, right? And a lot of those might be CUI assets. But there's other clouds that are complex where they'll do, vulnerability scanning plus directory plus file sharing. And what we request is that you break those complex clouds out into their components. So you can say, the cloud directory, that might be a security protection asset. The cloud file share, that might be a CUI asset. The cloud
SIM,
the SIM might be a security protection asset. So it helps to break out a complex cloud into sub areas to say what type of category they are if they're different. If everything is one category, then fine. Just say the entire cloud is that category.
Email.
Okay, so email might be an example of a contractor risk managed asset if you had prohibited CUI in email, right? So if your cloud includes an email service, that might be an example of a CRMA cloud. For external service providers, if you have delegated authority to them to do things, for example, they're allowed to pick their own administrators for your environment, it's very important to list them off in your asset inventory and mention that, right? So if you don't know the people from the managed services provider that have admin access, that's very important to know. And you'd probably mention that both in your people asset inventory as well as MSP inventory. And again, you should identify what asset category they belong to and justify it. Again, if you've got stuff that's out of scope, it's very helpful to us, not required, but very helpful to list it out and say why it's out of scope, preferably by describing the boundaries you have in place. What about applications? Do people need to list off Excel and their clock application?
I mean, I don't think it does any good to put Excel on there.
Well, what about a major database like an ERP solution?
Yeah.
So the last category of stuff we need in an asset inventory is going to be maybe complex applications or applications that might need to be assessed separate from their computers. So if, for example, on a typical laptop, It's not that big a deal to us as assessors that you've got Paintbrush installed and Microsoft Word and, a web browser, right? Great. We'll look at that as part of other requirements, but we don't need to assess your
Right.
Chrome example. But if you have a complex database solution or, some web application or, maybe a medical thing, that is good to list off separately. And typically we'd see that listed in your hardware inventory alongside the servers that host it. But if for some reason it's separate, please make sure to mention that and also, again, categorize it. What happens if the asset categorization does not make sense to us as assessors?
We say, this doesn't make sense. Basically.
Are we allowed as assessors to say, change the asset category?
I'll never come out and say that, but kind of give
It's
the
yeah,
idea.
it's I think it's undefined, right? That's
Yeah.
that's an area where it's not really considered consulting to say this
Right.
is not good scoping,
Right.
because we can't start an assessment if the scoping doesn't make sense. But at the same time, the scoping guides do say that it is on the client, the organization seeking certification, the company, to present their scoping.
I'll say stuff like, there's CUI on this, you know?
You just told me there's CUI on this, but
Right.
you've got it listed as a contractor risk managed asset.
Right. Which is common.
Could
Yeah.
you perhaps reconsider the categorization
Right.
that you have selected for that? Yeah. Okay. So the asset inventory, we just beat that one to death, but that was important because I don't think there's a whole lot of other people describing what needs to be seen there. The network diagrams, give us a network diagram. Ideal, if possible, it's nice to show what asset category the things are in the diagram, but it doesn't need to be that complex. What we really need to see is your logical and physical connections in terms of the network, your boundaries, and how each of your assets are connected to the network. So for example, if you've got a cell phone, typically that's not connected directly to your network, right? It's going to go through the cell tower and then come through an application interface, maybe to a cloud, right? So we want to see that as opposed to, your laptops might be establishing a VPN connection, or they might be connected to the local area network, which we also need to see. Your network diagram can be simple. So I am notorious for creating network diagrams using PowerPoint and occasionally Microsoft Paint.
It works.
It works. Yeah. You do not need to spend 100 hours making the most complex 2-point font,
right,
beautiful diagram, right? What we basically need is a representation of each of your major things, right? So a square for your laptops, a square for your server, a rectangle for the firewall, right?
Circle for boundaries and yeah.
Right? Yeah, exactly. It just needs it needs to be understandable to the assessors so that when we're looking at your asset inventory, and we're reading your SSP, we can kind of figure out how stuff is connected to each other.
You can even color code it. Like blue is CUI assets and red is security protection assets, things like that.
Yep. Nobody at Kieri Solutions is colorblind to my knowledge. But not yet. Well, we would help them if they were. Okay. Now, data flow diagrams. The data flow diagrams, and again, your assessor may be different, right? If you go with a different C3PAO, but for us, we need to see a functional method for you to receive CUI, for you to work on CUI, and for you to send out CUI. Even if you don't have CUI yet, maybe you're getting certified on a network that isn't in use yet. You should tell us where you plan on having the CUI and how you plan on doing the CUI. And that also goes for the asset inventory. If you don't have any CUI, you should tell us where it would be if you had it.
If you're sending CUI with encrypted email, you really need to tell us how that is going to work.
Yeah. So part of scoping is for us to test your boundary assumptions. And there's ways that people very commonly mess up where they think that something is secure, but it's not actually secure, or they don't even think about it, right? And when we're going through the scoping process, if you tell us that you are sending CUI unencrypted across the internet on purpose, it's a big problem.
Right.
So we're going to ask lots of questions about that.
If you're letting your remote workers print at home.
Big problem.
Big problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Unless you've got all the security for the home stuff. Right. Let's see. There's very common ways that companies mess up their boundaries, right? So, for example, if you don't tell people how to share CUI, then they're going to share all the ways. So it's actually much preferable for us to hear, these are the 3 ways you share CUI, than leaving that undefined. Because if you leave it undefined, we're going to be like, okay, well, then I'm going to assume that your employees are using Google Drive and Box and email and their personal Hotmail and who knows what, right? And that could be a stopping point for us during scoping.
Is Hotmail still a thing? Just
wonder. I still have a Hotmail email.
Do you?
I do. We're also going to ask how you keep your employees from using their personal computers for work, because that again is a super common way that people goof up the scoping. And you just need to be able to describe how you prevent that from happening. All right, so you've provided us the data flow diagrams, the asset inventory, the network diagrams, the system security plan. The reason why we want to see your system security plan is we're going to check whether you've marked practices implemented or not. Ideally, they're all marked implemented if you're asking for a CMMC assessment. We're going to check to see that none of the descriptions. So, sorry, let me reiterate that. The system security plan should describe your environment and your boundaries, right? So that gives us a little bit more information coming into the scoping call to understand what's going on with your environment. We're also going to be checking your system security plan to make sure that you have actually described how you're implementing the requirements.
The objectives. I mean, we're looking for the objectives. Even if you don't call them out, when we go through stuff, we're looking to make sure you meet all the requirements.
And I know that we're not assessing you at this point, but if we're in that early scoping stage and your system security plan says that 2/3 of the requirements are not met or not implemented, or
you have a sentence, or something that has 10,
right,
objectives.
If you did go through and mark everything implemented, but then all you did in the description area was you regurgitated part of the practice statement, that's also going to be a major problem. And we might cancel the assessment with you're not ready based on that, right? We need to see a description of how you are implementing the requirement.
A lot of times, SSPs that are like exported, people don't go in and like check to make sure that it actually says what it's supposed to, and not just, it happens when they're exported a lot that it's just a sentence that, restates the practice. So might want to check that.
Yeah, beware of your GRC website. The next thing that we're going to consider is customer responsibilities for external service providers. So if you are using a cloud service provider or you're using an external service provider like an MSP, during the scoping, we're probably going to ask you about whether you have a shared responsibility matrix and whether you are doing your responsibilities as part of that shared responsibility matrix. And we might also ask whether that external provider meets security requirements according to DFARS 252-204-7012 or the CMMC assessment process, if they've got access to your environment. Okay.
BIPs, certificates and stuff is another thing people forget.
Yeah, so now let's assume that we made it through scoping. We had the scoping call. You're looking pretty good. And we say, okay, we're going to continue. We don't see anything too terrible that's going to cause you to disastrously fail your assessment. Let's proceed to the assessment phase.
You may still fail.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's nothing that just screams out, Yeah.
Right. Again, half of your stuff is marked not implemented yet. We do not want to assess you.
Right. We're stopping there. Yeah.
So now you're going to have, between the scoping call and the assessment, you're typically going to have about a 4-week period with us to get ready for the assessment. We are going to remove all the stuff that you gave us. We're going to delete it from our system so that we don't inadvertently use old documents and data. We're going to start the assessment planning process with a big assessment plan. It's going to be, say, 20, 30 pages long. We're going to be reaching out to you to talk about the evidence that's required and what systems we need evidence for. All right, so typically we're going to need a minimum of one piece of evidence for each assessment objective in CMMC level 2.
And we call that out also in our next steps document. A lot of people miss it, that there's a summary, like an artifact summary. So we're like, okay, these are some of the things you might want to have. So yeah, you have that from the get-go.
Yeah, we send you a list of assessment objectives, and it's not a definitive thing, but hey, get ready, you need to expect to provide evidence at this level of detail.
Right.
Which is, bare minimum 320 different pieces of evidence, which could be an interview, it could be a demonstration, but in many cases, it's a document, it's an artifact, it's a screenshot, it's a report. And we try and get that to you as early as possible. I mean, a couple weeks before the scoping call, so that you can start preparing, right? Again, this is a serious endeavor. This is not an easy assessment.
Dates. Can we just say, if there's a date, submit your stuff before the date?
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so
that's a thing.
We need
your stuff, please.
We need your stuff before we do the engagement. So there's 2 drop dead dates on a typical assessment. There's the scoping call. We need your stuff before the scoping call, right? Several days before the scoping call. And then the actual assessment. We need your stuff a minimum of a full week before the actual assessment. And if you do not provide the stuff by those dates, at the scoping call, we might decide that you're not ready and you lose. I won't say you lose, but your planning deposit might be converted into a impromptu readiness assessment and then go back and spend more time getting ready.
If there's nothing for us to look at, like the night before scoping.
Yeah. There's only so much we can flex. And then for the actual assessment, we're not going to cancel your assessment at that point. You're just going to do very poorly on it. So this is not stuff where you can really try and just push the dates and see what you can pull off, because if we've literally told 2, 3, 4 people to clear their calendars for that week,
right?
Maybe travel, and we have a set amount of time to get this done. And if you don't provide us evidence, even if you provide us all the evidence in the middle of the assessment, if we don't have time to review it using our scheduled assessment hours, we are going to mark it not met. Or we're going to reach out to you and say, do you wish to pay a lot more money to get those 3 or 4 people to extend their assessment and travel again, right? We do not want this to happen. Like, this is not my ideal situation, right? I'm not trying to make money off of messing up the assessment.
That's why we're doing this video. Don't mess us up.
Yeah.
That's the meaning of the video.
We want this to be smooth and easy. And again, don't request an assessment if you're not ready for it, please. All right.
And right now, like in joint surveillance, don't wait to like the day before scoping and think you're gonna like reschedule with DibCAC.
Yeah. Yeah.
Things like that, it's just, whoa.
Yeah. For me, when I was going through my DIPCAC assessment, I would have had to be literally in the hospital in a coma
Right.
to be missing the dates. That's how important I thought they were. Now,
Right.
not everyone has that level of trauma going on, but we, our contracts are written out so that if, we're not going to change the dates, right? If you change the dates at the last minute, it incurs additional costs because, again, I have cleared the schedule of very expensive assessors to do this work, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that you are ready and you understand what is required before you get into this. But once we have started the process, it's going to be a penalty to you, not to us, if you miss one of these deadlines. And we really don't want that to happen. Okay, so evidence gathering. For Kieri Solutions, it took me a week to put together all of the evidence for our little tiny assessment. Okay, you should plan to spend a significant amount of time in the 3 weeks leading up to your real assessment to put together evidence. The evidence, again, your lead assessor is going to be working on an evidence plan with you. This is something that you should be talking to us about. If you have any questions, what do I need to provide you? I don't understand, right? We're going through the planning process. We're available for you to get this done. But we don't want to see old evidence. Okay, so if you took a screenshot of a setting a year ago, don't reuse that screenshot. We would like to see a freshly gathered screenshot, right? Now, if it's an artifact of something, say we need a vulnerability scan report, right? Sure, send us artifacts from any time within your operational period, right? If your network's been running for 2 years, you can pick from that period. Ideally, you show us stuff that's fairly recent as well. But we do want it recently gathered. Now,
It makes it very hard for an assessor if you have a policy that even if you're following it, the date that it was last revised was 2012. It's like,
yeah. There's an unwritten expectation for assessors that we want to see policies that have been version controlled within a year. But that's beside the point. That's going to be on a per case basis. I'm not saying that's something you have to do. But
you'll just make us like bang our heads on our desk for a little while.
You should expect to put together a package of, potentially hundreds of different files, digital files, which will include your core compliance stuff like the system security plan, risk assessment, plan of action, your asset inventories again, as well as your policies. You should have that all got ready to send us, right? The latest version of everything. You do not necessarily need to name those special. Okay. However, for each assessment objective that we need, like an artifact or a document, if it's not one of those core items, which is very easily identified, We will need them named in a very specific naming format, which we will provide to you, right? But it's roughly the practice ID, the assessment objective, your company name, the date that it was gathered. And then if you want, you can put a little tiny, this is our account list, whatever, right? Procedure for whatever. You should expect to compile all of those things into a set of folders and probably zip them up and submit your hundreds of files as a zip archive to us using the secure file share.
Don't
if you're
email
going,
them.
yeah, it's not good.
No.
If you're going through a joint surveillance voluntary assessment, you should plan on providing duplicate copies of all evidence, as well as your scoping stuff, to both us as well as the DCMA team. Don't send us separate ones. Just always send the exact same thing to both of us. Yep.
Same
thing. And again, it's easier if you zip them up and archive them when you send the stuff. Then you're not going to be missing one file here and there. Can you think of anything else in the preparation for assessment that people forget to do?
I can't think of anything, but all of this is a really good reason to work with people that know what they're doing to get you prepared to come to the C3PAO in the first place. We're saying a lot like in this video, but there are other companies that may not say anything to you about like what you need to give them, so yeah.
This is not a SOC 2 assessment. This is not an ISO 27001 assessment. This is far more stringent. You need, when you request an assessment, you should probably have your scoping stuff ready, right? Or at the very least, if you're asking for an assessment to be scheduled, have it ready at the point when you're asking for it to be scheduled. And yeah, you really do need CMMC specific expertise, ideally from a certified assessor, because those guys have to pass a test and take formal training to show that they know what they're doing. And I'm a broken record, but once you start the assessment process, we cannot help you. Right? We can try and prevent you from getting into the assessment if we think you're not ready. But once you get into this, once you pass scoping, this is going to happen one way or another. So that's why we're doing this call, to try and explain what you need to be ready and prepared to do, right? You need to plan that 3 weeks before your assessment, you're going to have a lot of people stop what they're doing and just gather evidence for the assessment.
You're going to have people for interviews and stuff during the week. So make sure you have the right people.
Yeah. During the assessment, it's very, very difficult to reschedule it at the last minute. The more notice you give us, the better, because then we're not literally having very expensive assessors doing nothing. We can potentially get them rescheduled somewhere, and we won't penalize you if we can do that. All right. Thank you, Jill.